Imagine you're a 6-year-old boy and you see your mom wearing lipstick and nail polish, and you think it's pretty, so you ask to wear some too. In response, your parents scream at you and you start crying, and they tell you to man up and that you shouldn't want to do such girly things. How would you feel for being told off for wanting to have fun? Would you be sad, frustrated, confused? Such is the case for many boys everywhere who are faced with toxic masculinity. And today I will be advocating for people to teach their young relatives that the way that they express themselves both creatively and emotionally has nothing to do with their validity as boys or their validity with any gender in general. Addressing these negative concepts of boys and men's behavior is essential because toxic masculinity is often at the root of gendered violence. Seeing as how I wrote my previous informational speech on femicides, which is murder of women, as a manifestation of this gendered violence, I feel I have more context on the subject and how someone might reduce the high numbers of gender violence than the average person. First, I will be defining toxic masculinity and gendered violence. Then I will be talking about how they relate to each other. And then lastly, I will be talking about some strategies that I want you to implement with your younger relatives. To start, in order to explain the relationship between gender violence and toxic masculinity, I will define the two terms and give you some context. So the UN Women is a United Nations entity working for the empowerment of women around the world. They define gender-based violence as harmful acts directed to an individual or a group of individuals based on their gender. This definition can include any violence committed based on or as a result of gender relations. Still, gender violence is used mainly to refer to power differentials that place women and girls at risk for multiple forms of violence at the hands of a man. As mentioned before, femicide is considered gender-based because it happens when a girl or a woman is killed, um, usually by a man, solely because they are a girl or a woman. As for toxic masculinity, it is often used to refer to cultural norms such as gender norms that turn men against themselves. An article written by Maya Salam in the New York Times, published in 2019, says that the term toxic masculinity originated in women's studies classrooms, but now it's used to identify anything that belittles someone for not being manly enough, and it includes aspects of homophobia, greed, and other things like that that are typically characterized as hypermasculine. An example of toxic masculinity is believing that crying is girly or that being nice makes you gay. The notion that letting your feelings out or that being nice makes you gay is harmful because it leads to a buildup of stress and emotions that can come out negatively because people aren't being allowed to be themselves. An example involving creative expression would be like telling boys that playing with dolls or playing house is for girls only. Not only does this limit the child's creativity, also increasing those negative feelings and stress, but it makes no sense because it implies that boys can't and don't grow up to become fathers to have families later on. Moving on to my second point, knowing about toxic masculinity matters because violence stems from the relationship between genders. To expand upon this idea, I'll refer back to the previous example of teaching boys to hold back their emotions. The American Psychology Association, also known as APA, is a professional organization that represents US psychologists. They published an article in a newsletter titled Harmful Masculinity and Violence, in which they state that the restriction of emotional expression and pressure to conform to expectations of dominance and aggression may heighten the potential for boys to engage in um, in general acts of violence, including but not limited to bullying, physical violence, or any sort of assault. To clarify, this means that when boys are emasculated for being human and letting their emotions out, they feel the need to prove themselves by resorting to drastic extremes of the masculine ideal. In connection to violence against women, the World Health Organization, which is an agency of the United Nations dealing with public health, released data in 2018 in a book called Violence Against Women Prevalence Estimates that showed that an estimated 736 million women aged 15 and older, which is equivalent to 30% of women, have been subjected to intimate partner violence and non-partner sexual aggression, or both, at least once in their lives. To clarify, partner violence would be violence that comes from someone you're in a relationship with, and no partner sexual violence comes from when you are sexually assaulted or attacked by a stranger or someone you are not in a relationship with. To put these numbers into perspective, 736 million women is equivalent to 1 in 3 women aged 50 and up who have experienced this, showing that this is prevalent and can happen to anyone. I have two sisters, meaning one of us could be the 1 in 3, and that is very scary. Now that I've shown you how restricting male self-expression with toxic masculinity relates to gendered violence, I'll be discussing some prevention strategies that you have to implement with your male relatives, whether this be anybody that looks up to you or your children. Referring back to the APA newsletter article, one way that they say to reduce harmful male ideas is to promote healthy relationship skills that decrease teens' acceptance of traditional norms and dating violence. So a specific form of doing this would be to teach adolescents about informed consent. Informed consent means um, to have the agreement of both parties before doing anything, whether it's kissing, hugging, as long as both parties agree to it, everything is all right. This would help because it would stop promoting the idea that a man in a relationship with a woman has to be dominant and aggressive to prove that they are the man in the relationship. Something else that the newsletter recommends is to identify and treat psychological distress that comes with following social norms. And there are multiple ways of doing this. One of those ways would be to go to a therapist to talk about your problems, or if you're a parent, to make sure that your child's mental health is stable. But if neither of those are viable for you, or don't apply to you, all you have to do is be a shoulder to lean on. If someone comes to you to discuss issues that they have encountered while upholding certain social expectations, you can comfort them by telling them that their feelings are normal and that it's helpful to talk things through. And lastly, another way to help a situation is to take a look at your own perspective and how you may be promoting harmful masculinity. You may not be doing it on purpose since you most likely grew up with these ideas yourself, but it's important to be introspective since issues revolving around social norms will only be resolved through a collective effort in which everyone agrees to stop emasculating children and making them feel inferior for being themselves. Today, I went over the definition of toxic masculinity and gender violence. I talked about the relationships with each other, and I went over a few prevention strategies to promote healthy self-expression and reduce the rates of violence. Due to harmful standards that boys are subjected to thanks to toxic masculinity, one can see that the aspects of these ideals affect not only the person that has to suffer to uphold them, but also those around them. In the end, now that I have presented you with some ideas on how to improve the situation, make sure to employ these to ensure more positive experiences with self-expression and general safety for all genders now and in the future.